Hello dear listener, please subscribe to our channel. Enjoy watching. I've heard it said that betrayal sneaks up on you, that you only notice it when it's right in your face. But for me, I could sense it coming like an overcast sky before a storm. Maybe that's the price of spending too much time out in the vineyard, planting, pruning, watching over the vines for any sign of rot. You learn to see it early on, that small shadow on the grape that lets you know something is wrong. And when it came to Julia, my own wife, my business partner, the woman I'd built a life with, I didn't need much to see that something was rotting beneath the surface. It's hard to know where it started. Maybe it was her long glances out the window, the way she took longer to answer when I asked her simple questions, like if she wanted coffee. Maybe it was how her laughter seemed to hang in the air, almost forced, when she'd come home late from a day of meeting new suppliers. But if I had to pinpoint it, I'd say it began the day we hired Luis. Luis was a seasonal worker, here on a visa, as some of them are. He was younger than us, maybe mid-30s, and fit from years of working vineyards in Chile. He had that sort of easy charm, an eye for the land, and Julia, well, she was enchanted. I could see it every time she talked about him. She didn't have to say much for me to know, it was all in her tone, that subtle little spark I hadn't seen in her in years. Luis says this is the best soil he's seen in years, she'd say, with a grin that stretched a bit too wide. He's really something, isn't he? The way he talks about the vines, he just knows them. It's like he feels what they need. She would say things like this, in passing, and I'd nod along, brushing it off as just her excitement for the vineyard. But a small part of me, a part one tried to ignore, wondered if there was more to it. One day, she went on and on about how he'd suggested a different pruning technique, and how she couldn't wait to see if it would increase the yield this year. I couldn't help but feel a pang in my chest. I'd been working these vines for years, had pruned every single row myself, and suddenly this guy comes along, and it's like she'd forgotten I existed. But I kept my mouth shut, let her enthusiasm roll off me like water off a duck's back. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Then came the late nights. She'd say she had to stay late at the vineyard to work with Luis on a new trellising technique. And I tried to tell myself that maybe, just maybe, I was reading too much into it. But when she'd come back, her hair disheveled, that strange glow on her face, it was hard to keep lying to myself. The night that finally shattered my last ounce of trust was one when she'd told me she'd be staying out late with suppliers. The vineyard was slow that week, and we hadn't had any real supplier meetings on the books, so it set off alarm bells. I waited until she left, then drove over to the vineyard myself. It was pitch black, barely a single light on except for a small glow coming from the barrel room, the place where we kept our best wines aging. And when I cracked the door open, quietly, mind you, I saw her and Luis, wrapped around each other like they'd been doing it for months. My heart dropped right then, my mind went blank. I watched them for a good 20 seconds, just to burn it in my brain, to make sure I'd never forget what I was seeing. I crept back to my car without them hearing me, and as I sat there gripping the steering wheel, something inside me shifted. The love I'd felt for her turned cold, solidified into something darker, something patient and razor-sharp. I wasn't going to scream, wasn't going to confront her. No, I wanted to show her just how it felt to be blindsided, to have everything you love slip through your fingers like sand. I went home that night and didn't say a word when she walked in a couple hours later. If she had any suspicion, she didn't let it show. She walked in like she was strolling through the front door after a pleasant day with friends, no guilt, no shame. That was all I needed to seal my resolve. I bided my time over the next month, playing the part of the doting husband, bringing her coffee in the morning, helping her with invoices, pretending I knew nothing. But in the back of my mind, I was building a plan, one that would not only get even, but leave her wondering if it had all been worth it. Step 1 was simple. I started talking to her about expanding. I pitched it to her as if it was my best idea yet, something I'd been thinking about to bring new life into the vineyard. Think about it, I told her over dinner one night. A second vineyard, Julia. Not just any place either, by the coast, where we can tap into those coastal breezes and really expand our brand. We could make coastal blends that the sommeliers would line up for. Her eyes lit up like I'd just handed her a winning lottery ticket. She was all in. Little did she know, I'd made sure this expansion was the perfect trap. Now, this wasn't just about business, I had to make sure it would pull her in emotionally. So I'd bring her brochures of coastal vineyards, talk about the cool, foggy air, how we'd put our own spin on coastal wines, maybe even hire someone young and vibrant to manage it. I planted little seeds, enough to make her buy in without even realizing it was all part of my setup. By the time I finally told her it was a done deal, that I'd found the perfect spot and started the paperwork, she was ready to pull every penny we had to invest. I acted hesitant, even doubtful, saying we'd have to sell our current vineyard to make it work. But she was so starstruck by the whole idea that she barely batted an eye. She was ready to leave everything we'd built behind, sell off our first vineyard, the one we'd spent years building with our bare hands, just to chase this fantasy I'd spun for her. Over the next few weeks, I made sure she put her name on every document. She didn't suspect a thing, because I'd built her confidence up to the point that she thought she was in control of it all. And when the day came to finalize, I told her we'd celebrate with a bottle of our finest wine, the same wine that had earned us our reputation in the first place. She came into the tasting room where I was waiting with the bottle, a 2015 Cabernet that had been her favorite. As we drank, I made a toast. I looked her in the eyes, raised my glass, and said, "To new beginnings." At that moment, she still had no idea what I'd done. She took the glass, raised it, and clinked it against mine. Her face softened as she looked at me, and for a split second, I felt a strange pang of sadness. We'd built so much together. There was a time when I thought she was my forever, that we'd spend our last years looking out over the vineyard as the sun set. But that version of Julia, the one who'd met every promise she made, was long gone, buried beneath a woman who'd been willing to throw it all away for a thrill. "To new beginnings," she said, her voice a bit too cheerful, as if she were talking about a dream coming true rather than ripping apart everything we'd built. She had no idea just how true those words would be. After she took the first sip, I watched her expression closely, waiting for even the smallest flicker of doubt. But there was nothing. She was oblivious. All she could taste was our best wine, the bottle we'd saved for special occasions. And tonight was a special occasion, just not in the way she thought. "Isn't it incredible?" she murmured, staring at her glass like it held something magical. "I always thought this was the best bottle we ever made." She took another sip, savoring it, letting it roll over her tongue. "Yes, it's fitting," I said, forcing a small smile. "This wine got us everything we have now." She beamed at me, still oblivious, still blind to the fact that I was about to rip her carefully built fantasy apart. I leaned forward, pretending to look thoughtful, and asked, "Julia, you ever wonder what would happen if we lost it all?" She looked at me, confused. "Lost what?" "The vineyard?" I nodded. "All of it. Say, we bet everything on this coastal vineyard, every last penny, and then it just fell apart." I shrugged, trying to keep my voice casual. "What would we do then?" She laughed, a carefree sound that grated on my nerves. "David, that's why we're selling the original vineyard, right? To make sure we have the funds to make this work. I mean, it's a risk, sure, but it's the kind of risk that pays off." I nodded, smiling in a way that must have looked genuine because she just kept smiling back. "Right. But you're so confident, aren't you? That this whole plan is solid." She nodded, her face softening again, leaning forward as if she were speaking to a child. "David, we'll be fine. I know it's a big leap, but trust me. This is what we need. It's what I need." She reached out to touch my hand, and for a moment, I almost believed she meant it. But then I remembered her texts to Luis, her lies, her dismissive little glances. All the times she'd slipped away to meet him, her late nights. And suddenly, I felt my smile turn cold. "Funny you should say that," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "Because you do know, Julia, that the coastal vineyard you just signed off on doesn't even exist, right?" I watched the color drain from her face, saw the confusion shift to dawning horror. She blinked at me, mouth half open. What are you talking about? There's no coastal vineyard, Julia, I said, my voice a low whisper now. There never was. It was all a story. A little fairy tale I made up for you. Every last detail, from the location to the contracts, especially the contracts. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulling out the signed papers and tossing them onto the table between us. All in your name. Every debt, every unpaid invoice. You've got no vineyard, no assets, no money. Nothing. It's all gone. Her face went pale as she grabbed the papers, frantically flipping through them. She could barely get the words out. You forged this? I shook my head, smirking. No, Julia, you signed it. Every page. I just gave you the pen and let you ruin yourself. All I did was give you a little nudge. Her hands were shaking now, her eyes wild. David, what are you talking about? You wouldn't do this. We're partners. We've built everything together. I leaned forward, letting the venom creep into my voice. We built everything, Julia. You and I. But I guess that wasn't enough for you, was it? You needed more excitement. Someone young and vibrant like Louise to make you feel alive again. I watched her flinch, the truth finally sinking in, her face twisted in panic. But, David, that's not, she trailed off, unable to finish her sentence, and I could see it, the realization, the understanding that I knew everything. All her little games, her whispered secrets, her late nights, everything. It's all yours now, Julia, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Every single debt. Every legal tie to this place. I've cut myself free of it all. You wanted new beginnings, and now you have one. Her eyes filled with tears, and she reached out, as if to grab my hand. But I pulled back, standing up slowly. She looked up at me, her face crumbling, her body shaking. David, please. You don't have to do this. We can fix this, we can go back to how things were. Just, let's talk, okay? I almost laughed. The nerve of her, thinking that she could talk her way out of this. That she could lie and betray me and then simply plead her way back into my life. But I wasn't done yet. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a second document, one I'd been saving for this exact moment. Divorce papers, I said, setting them down in front of her. Signed and finalized. You're free now, Julia. Free to run off to whoever you want. But just know this, you'll be doing it broke. She looked down at the papers, stunned, her hands trembling. And then she looked up at me, her eyes wide and hollow. You're serious, she whispered, her voice cracking. I nodded, a cold satisfaction washing over me. Dead serious. With that, I turned and walked out, leaving her there in the tasting room, clutching the divorce papers, the contract, and the empty glass. I didn't look back. If you leave a comment, tell us what you think about the story you heard. It's important to us and will help us find and tell stories that you find interesting. Thank you for watching us.